Hello, listeners, and welcome to a new episode of Business Compact, the podcast for founders, seasoned business owners, or everybody else who is interested in learning about the world of international business. In each episode, we will explore topics related to the creation, growth, and globalization of businesses, from founding challenges to international growth opportunities. Our guests will share their insights, personal opinions, and lessons learned along the way, inspiring you to take a closer look at each individual discussed topic. My name is Tobias Kerkhoff, and I'm the General Manager for Internationalization at WannaBe International Business and your host for this episode. I hope you enjoy the upcoming conversation, and as always, if you have any comments, need support for your international business, or want to be on this podcast as a guest too, you're welcome to contact me under my email shown at the beginning of this episode. Finally, of course, feel free to subscribe to this podcast and our newsletter. Joining me on today's podcast episode is a good friend and the managing director of the Dutch Colombian Chamber of Commerce, also known as Holland House. He has done an outstanding job over the last 10 years, boosting the internationalization and growth not only of the more than 300 members, but also of the organization itself, building a team of almost 50 employees. Welcome, Jan-Willem van Bokhoven. It's a real pleasure having you on our podcast.
Thank you, Tobias, for receiving me today.
Then let's start right away. Last year, your organization celebrated its 10 years of presence in Bogota. First of all, congratulations on that. Could you give us an overview of the activities of Holland House, not only in Colombia, and your professional background also?
Thank you. Yeah, that was a very special moment for us to be able to celebrate 10 years of Holland House Colombia. I came to Colombia in 2013. My background is in business administration. I started working with Latin America during my internships, during my study. And I realized that I wanted to do more between Europe and Latin America. So I got the question early 2013 if I wanted to become the first director of Holland House Colombia, and I decided to accept. That's a little over 10 years ago. I'm still here. I think that's a good sign. The Holland House Colombia was actually the first bilateral chamber with this concept in the world. So we were the first ones, and today there's about 25 of these kind of chambers from the Netherlands in different emerging markets worldwide. But Colombia was the first one. So it was the idea was to not only support the existing business community, so the Dutch companies present in Colombia, but also to give a soft landing to many new companies that still had to take the step. I think if you look at Colombia, country with a lot of potential, but 10 years ago, the Dutch presence here was very limited. So the objective was to increase the presence, and that's what has happened since then. We do all kinds of things to help companies from market information to matchmaking, to introducing them to clients, to partners, helping them establish a company here, find the right personnel. So everything needed for new Dutch companies to become active here. And there's happened a lot since then. Not only did we celebrate 10 years, 10 years ago, we had about 35 Dutch companies or with Dutch capital active in Colombia. Today, that's more than 400. So that's quite a lot of increase of Dutch presence here. And that has happened basically in the last 10 years.
Thank you for your introduction. We first met personally in 2019 in Bogota, if I remember correctly, and I still wasn't aware of all these facts you've just named. But of course, I'm aware that you've been living in Colombia for over 10 years now, despite many challenges, for example, the traffic jams. But what is it that still fascinates you about this country after all these years?
Good question. Indeed, we have worked together in the past and we still keep working together. So that's very nice. And I think that's also one of the things I think in Colombia, if you look at the country, it's a very diverse country with different regions, different landscapes, different people, different industries. So it's a country of diversity. It's a very beautiful country in all ways. I love my home country and maybe I will go back someday. But I think if you look at the Netherlands, people mainly think in limitations. So if you have a new idea, then a lot of people say, yeah, but did you think about this? Or did you think about this? While being in Colombia, I think you still dare to think in opportunities, in potential, in what still needs to be done. And that doesn't mean it's always easy or it's always quick, but there is a lot of opportunities in different industries, in different sectors. And that's what I think, that diversity combined with the willingness of the people to make this country change, to benefit together from the opportunities. I think that's what keeps fascinating me of this country.
I totally agree. I'm still fascinated too by the diversity of the country and, of course, the warm hearted people in Colombia. Both the Netherlands and Colombia have a very strong agricultural sector. For instance, your compatriots are pioneers in vertical farming, seed technology, and robotics in milking and harvesting. Colombia, on the other hand, is still somehow, let's call it, more traditional in terms of the innovation level. Besides, what other industries play a crucial role in your daily business?
Yes, indeed. Agriculture is one of the main sectors in which we work. If you realize that the Netherlands in technology, but also in trade, the Netherlands is the second exporter worldwide of agricultural products after the United States. So we are very dependent on trade and also on producing a lot in a very small country. I think if you look at Colombia, Colombia has everything that the Netherlands doesn't have in agriculture. So a lot of land, a lot of different climates, a lot of crops that, of course, couldn't grow in the Netherlands. So the potential of Colombia combined with the biodiversity, of course, that makes that there's actually a very good combination, because everything we don't have, Colombia has it. That also creates a mutual need to work together. Agriculture is a very important sector for us, but we work in many other industries where we see, or there's a very vibrant trade, or there's a lot of knowledge exchange. So other sectors we prioritize are, we do a lot in infrastructure, mainly maritime infrastructure, so ports and inland navigation. We work a lot in the medical sector. Pharmaceutical are very important industries. We do a lot also everything related to sustainable development, climate adaptation. Colombia is one of the countries most affected by climate change. So there's a lot of projects also to work together on adaptation. We do a lot in the IT sector. So Colombia is quickly becoming an important nearshoring location, mainly also for the United States and Canada. So the IT sector is also a very important sector for us. But there's many more, but that's to name a few.
Thanks for sharing these insights. Especially the IT software industry keeps on growing, turning, for instance, Medellin with its business and innovation center Ruta into a hotspot for IT developers. In Europe, at least in Germany, we have often heard the term de-risking ultimately, which refers to a reduction of trade policy dependency, especially regarding China. How do you assess the role of Latin America in this context?
I think if you look at the last 10 years, I don't think Latin America has received the priority from Europe it should have received. So maybe the focus has been on other regions. I do see a change in the last 2 years, that there is a renewed interest in strengthening the relationship with Latin America. But that's after a lot of years in which I think Latin America should have been a higher priority. You do see in the past 2 years that for Europe, Latin America is becoming more strategic. Then, of course, there's the European vision, every country that also does its own foreign diplomacy. If you look at the Netherlands, Latin America used to be almost a blind spot. Today it isn't, but there is a clear focus. If you look at the Dutch agenda, there's actually only 3 countries in the region that are a priority. So for the Netherlands, Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia are the 3 priority countries. And for those countries, there's a lot of help, there's a lot of support and all kinds of instruments available to actually make the step for new Dutch companies to those 3 countries easier. But that also means that for the other countries like Chile or Peru or Argentina, they are not in the focus, which doesn't mean that nothing happens, but a lot less happens than for the other 3 countries. So you do see in the Dutch agenda that at least Colombia is a country to which quite a lot of priority is given.
Totally makes sense to me. If we want to take this de-risking strategy seriously, Latin America must be included as a partner on equal terms, no longer only as a partner guaranteeing access to raw materials or cheap labor. One factor in the context of partnerships is free trade agreements, which facilitate access to new markets by reducing tax burdens, for example. Unfortunately, the EU-Mercosur free trade agreement, despite more than 2 decades of negotiations, is still not signed, for instance, because of national interests or strict regulations from the European Union's supply chains, environmental protection, just to name some. In my opinion, the roles have now been reversed and Europe is more dependent on the goodwill of Latin American countries. Can we still afford it to continue neglecting Latin America in these times?
I think indeed it could be that the roles have interchanged a little bit in the past years. Of course, as Europe, there's the awareness that we need to work together and that Latin America is an important piece in our world panorama. So I do think at this moment for Europe to have a free trade agreement with the Mercosur would be very convenient. So I do agree that maybe there's a shift. 10 years ago in 2013, when the Holland House Colombia started, that was also the year the European Union signed the free trade agreement with Colombia and Peru. So we have a free trade agreement for 10 years now. And of course, you see at least you see a shift in trade where before it was most mining and oil and gas. Today it's much more agriculture and also, fortunately, every time more transformed and value added products that go from Colombia to Europe. But for Mercosur, that step has not been taken the same way. So I think it would be very valuable for the future. But indeed, the difficult discussion is, of course, Europe is changing. So we have the Green Deal, we have the farm to fork policy. And that's actually not only a policy for Latin America, but for the whole world. So for suppliers from all continents to Europe. That's, of course, a very painful element in discussions for the Mercosur, that in the end, those rules in Europe are quite strict and not that easy to comply with. In any free trade agreement discussion, of course, they would prefer to also soften those regulations in Europe. But the difficult thing is that Europe cannot soften them for one region or for a sub-region within a region because it's a worldwide policy. So I think that makes the discussion quite difficult, Tobias.
Of course, apart from the possible EU-Mercosur free trade agreement, other political initiatives are taken. For instance, the modernization of the existing EU-Chile Association Agreement in December 2022, and hopefully the assignment of this free trade agreement with the country this year. Nevertheless, we Europeans, at least speaking from my German perspective, have neglected Latin America as an investment market within the last 10 years or even longer, especially in comparison with China. Hence, China, as the winner of this uncertainty, strategically exploits this situation by focusing on strong expansion in the region and providing access to favorable financing opportunities. So a prime example is the construction of the first metro in Bogota, a $4 billion project only for the first line, won by a consortium of China's harbor engineering company and China Metro Company together with a Canadian Bombardier. Do you think that European companies are still competitive in the region?
I think in general, European companies are still competitive in the region. The number of European companies being successful or investing in Colombia or in the region is still growing. So in that sense, I do believe that there's still enough to do. But of course, the competition from the Chinese is fierce. And that's also, if you look at Latin America, the different countries, then you see at this moment a lot of public-private partnerships to actually be able to carry out the big infrastructure projects, and finance becomes a very important part of the equation. That also means that the Chinese have the advantage that for them, bringing the finance is usually a bit easier than the European companies that have a lot of internal rules, that do have a lot of internal bureaucracy, and also don't want to take too many risks. That's different in many cases for the Chinese. So that gives a competitive advantage that you see in practice. But of course, there's differences per country. You see the Chinese in the whole region growing and every time more present and more competitive. But if you look at Colombia and still at the figures, if you look at FDI figures in Colombia, you still see that the European Union and the United States are the biggest investors in the country by far. But there's, of course, other countries in the region where the Chinese investment is surpassing the ones of Europe or the United States. But in Colombia, still by far, the biggest investors are the European Union and the United States.
I have to admit that this was an ironic question. So, according to my own experience working in the past as a consultant in Colombia, the label made in Germany is still a proof of quality, pushing German sales and brand images in the region. Nevertheless, this is no guarantee of long-term success without further local investment and commitment from European companies. Of course, you as Holland House, you're not exclusively acting on your own. There are other important players from business and politics too. How would you describe the cooperation with other countries, their chambers of commerce, embassies, local institutions, and of course, the private sector?
We do believe that in many cases, together we are stronger. And then, of course, in a country like Colombia, there must be around 40 bilateral chambers. Of those 40, there are 7 from European countries. And what we do see in practice is that between the European countries, we share the same vision, we share the same priorities. We also find each other within the European Commission and the regulations and the changes taking place there. So in practice, we most of all work very much together with the European chambers in Colombia, with the Germans, with the French, with the Italians, with the Spanish, but also with the Swiss and British chambers. Because in many cases, if you talk about lobby or you talk about advocacy, we are much stronger together, because if the message comes from the whole European front, that is, of course, much more powerful. We do work together, and the same we do with the public sector. So also we work very much together with the embassies, because also if you talk about local government, then to do it together with the public part, while being the private part in the case of a bilateral chamber, that's also quite crucial. Many times work together on a European level, most of all, and for specific things, sometimes also with other regions, but the typical thing is that most of all between the European chambers, we do work together very much.
Thanks again for sharing these interesting insights. We have almost come to the end of today's episode. Final question. Sadly, there exist still many negative stereotypes of Colombia in the world. However, we both know that this country offers much more than that. In a nutshell, why should companies invest in Colombia?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I do recognize what you say. Although it's getting better, at least in the Netherlands, 10 years ago, the only image of Colombia was what we maybe see today on Netflix. But it has been changing gradually. It's not from one day to the other, but it has been changing. And that's, of course, hard work to promote and to give a much more real panorama of the country, which, of course, is still a country with a lot of social differences, but it's also a great country with a lot of potential and, in the end, the third economy of South America. So we have been promoting that to change a bit the stereotypes that exist or existed. And that's a lot of hard work, but we are not alone in that. But I think Colombia as a country, there's a lot of reasons to think of this country. I also mentioned the size of the economy. The second one would be location. Colombia is very conveniently located between the two oceans. Colombia is at the center of the Pacific Alliance, which I think is the best working trade bloc in Latin America. The third one would be people. Colombia has a very young population with around percent of the population 30 years and younger, well educated in different sectors. That offers, from a human resource perspective, a lot of opportunities. And I think also the diversification. Colombia has been a country that always depended on commodities mainly, but you do see bit by bit diversification of the economy. We are, I think, very like-minded in Europe. And when you talk about energy transition, or you talk about sustainable value chains in the agricultural sector, or you talk about nearshoring, I think Colombia is at the forefront in the region, which actually makes it extra attractive for European companies. There are more reasons, but I think this would be the main one.
Thank you, Jan Willem, for this interesting conversation. And I'd like to close today's episode with surprising facts about Colombia. It's the country with the second highest biodiversity worldwide, number one emerald exportation nation, accounting for 70 to 90% of worldwide production, and also the second largest flower exportation nation, behind the Netherlands, of course. Jan Willem, all the best for you.
Thank you, Tobias, and hope to see you in Germany, in the Netherlands, or in Colombia. Have a great day, and thank you for this opportunity.